Good evening, everyone. Dr. Matthew Pendergraft grew up in Imperial Beach, so he's come back to us and attended Mar Vista High School. He attended Southwestern College for several years before transferring to UC San Diego, where he earned a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Chemistry and a Bachelor of Arts in Spanish Literature. Afterwards, he moved to Buenos Aires, where he worked in atmospheric chemistry. Then he moved to New Orleans to earn a Master of Science from Tulane, using isotope geochemistry to investigate the breakdown of oil from the BP Deepwater Horizon spill. He returned to San Diego to earn a PhD in oceanography from UC San Diego's Scripps Institute of Oceanography. His PhD research focused on the transfer of enzymes, bacteria, and pollution in sea spray and aerosols, and I think we're going to hear some about that tonight. Matthew, over to you.
Thank you for the nice introduction. I will go ahead and share my screen. And thank you all for joining today for this talk on bacterial and chemical evidence of coastal water pollution from the Tijuana River and sea spray aerosol. This was part of my PhD research in Kim Prather research group at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. And I'll get right into it. So this is an aerosols talk. And so first I'd like to talk about them. And so atmospheric aerosols are microscopic particles in the air. So one type is, for example, smoke. Here we see in a satellite image, we see smoke from wildfires being blown across the continent. We see a couple of things here with atmospheric aerosols. One of them is just the scale here. So we see, they travel far through the atmosphere. And another one, which I focused on for my PhD within the National Science Foundation Center for Aerosol Impacts on the Chemistry and the Environment, is sea spray aerosol. Now, sea spray aerosol is the most abundant aerosol type in the atmosphere by mass. So it's a very significant atmospheric aerosol type, with the oceans covering roughly 70% of planet Earth. And here we're at the connection with NCCCA is aerosols play critical roles in Earth's weather and climate. For example, I like to start off with the water cycle, which a lot of us learned about in elementary school. And we're taught that the water cycle has evaporation and then condensation and precipitation. But they didn't tell us an important part of that water cycle, which are aerosols. Often that's left out. And so clouds form by the condensation of water vapor onto aerosols. So aerosols provide this surface in the atmosphere for water vapor, individual water molecules to condense onto. So obviously this is crucial for fresh water on planet Earth, and also has a cooling effect on the planet. So the message here is, in the atmosphere, water molecules don't stick to each other to form clouds. That doesn't happen. So without aerosols in our atmosphere, there would be no clouds and no rain. So this is what brought me to study aerosols at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. So aerosols significantly affect Earth's radiative balance, for example. They cool the planet. So you have what's called the direct effect of aerosols. That's aerosols directly interacting with radiation in the atmosphere, and that can have warming or cooling effects. And then there's what's called the indirect effect. So aerosols, form clouds, and then you have cooling relating to that for the scattering of that radiation, the cooling effect in the atmosphere. Another important climate role of aerosols, atmospheric aerosols, is ice nucleation. So that's the facilitation of the freezing of water. And this has implications for cloud lifetime, albedo or reflectivity, and precipitation. The composition influences the ability for ice to nucleate in the atmosphere. Here we have kind of a simplified data set showing that bacteria nucleate ice at warmer temperatures than does sodium sulfate aerosols. So in the absence of any particles, water would freeze at a very, very cold temperature, say roughly minus 38 degrees Celsius, perhaps as pure, say, water droplet suspended. We're unfamiliar with that because we never deal with absolutely pure water. So the composition of what else is in, say, aerosols in water in the atmosphere influences at what temperatures they freeze at, and that has big implications for cloud lifetime, albedo, and precipitation. So this is just another important role, atmospheric and climate role that aerosols play in the atmosphere. So in that last slide, I said this, that aerosol composition influences their atmospheric roles. Brings us to the question, so what's in sea spray aerosol? The most abundant aerosol type by mass in Earth's atmosphere. Sea spray aerosol composition is the function of seawater composition, and seawater composition is shaped by microorganisms. First and foremost, microorganisms, or seawater is replete with microorganisms. Every milliliter droplet of seawater contains, on average, in the surface ocean, 1 million bacteria and 10 million viruses. Here we're looking at a microscope image of seawater where DNA is stained. And so we can identify microorganisms that have intact DNA using a microscope that myself and colleagues took. The other thing in seawater is we also have phytoplankton. So using another light filter, we can pick out the phytoplankton because they have chlorophyll, and that can be picked up by the microscope. The seawater is chock full of microorganisms naturally. And this induces and shapes the chemical composition of seawater. So you have the composition of seawater, the chemical. So within seawater, you have the microorganisms, and that's already shaping their composition because microorganisms are part of that. But also you have phytoplankton's growth producing organic matter in seawater. And this then gets processed by bacteria, shaping the organic composition of seawater. And here is just for a visual. We can see that here we see, we're looking through seawater in two different parts of the ocean. And I think everyone can tell that the seawater in these two places does not have the same composition. So seawater composition varies greatly, mostly by the actions of microorganisms. And bacteria transfer to the atmosphere in sea spray aerosol. So little visual aid there, they transfer directly. That's because they're small size, great candidates to transfer. They're small enough to transfer into sea spray aerosol. They're, say, nominally marine bacteria are 1 micrometer or 1 micron across. And that falls right in the range of sea spray aerosols, particles produced by breaking waves and bursting bubbles. Here in the research center, work captured an image of an intact bacterium. This wasn't sampled from seawater, it's actually sampled from the particles being produced by breaking waves from seawater, and it shows an intact bacterium, this is my favorite evidence of demonstrating bacteria transfer in sea spray aerosol. And I'll just leave it here. I'll go back. If I didn't make it clear enough, sea spray aerosols produce, you have breaking waves and bursting bubbles, and primarily from those bursting caps of those bubbles, you have ejecting small microscopic, basically aerosol of seawater. Imagine you can think of them as microscopic droplets roughly on the size of 1 micrometer. That's how sea spray aerosol is produced. And whatever's in the surface water that is small enough to transfer is likely to transfer into the atmosphere in those sea spray aerosol, such as bacteria. part of my PhD research, we collaborated with the Knight Lab, who leads the COVID testing at UC San Diego and is the world leader in genetic sequencing. And we work to improve our ability to use genetic sequencing to identify which types of bacteria are in sea spray aerosol. And we did that, and we set these limits of detection in terms of sampling time for this system, 4 hours of sampling time, or a volume of air, 37 liters of air, or about 4 million sea spray aerosol. Or another limit of detection, we hit about 1,000 bacteria. Once we've collected those amounts, we have sequencing success because we have enough sample. So another way that water composition changes is by pollution. So pollution influences seawater chemical composition and its bacteria community. Here we're looking at an aerial image provided by Wild Coast, which of the Tijuana River flowing into the coastal waters of Imperial Beach, and you can see the discoloration, which is probably mostly attributed to sediments. But here it's clear that the composition of these waters are being influenced by that river, and that river is anytime it's flowing, for the most part, it's rather polluted. So while the microorganisms naturally change seawater composition, this is another way that seawater composition changes through pollution inputs. And we're aware of the headlines of these large volumes, and this year even more flows into these coastal waters, affecting their composition and raising health concerns. We conducted a study that identified an airborne transmission pathway for coastal water pollution. Here, what we did was we tested for the potential for coastal water pollution to aerosolize in sea spray aerosol. And this was published back in 2021. And the way we did this is in collaboration with coastal oceanographers. We released a non-toxic dye, which replicated coastal water pollution at realistic scale. So it may not be completely obvious to everybody, but here again, we're looking at an aerial image of Imperial Beach, and we have a magenta tint to the water there, in particular, say south of the pier, of the Imperial Beach Pier. And that's this non-toxic dye that served two purposes for this. First, the coastal oceanographers, such as Dr. Sarah Giddings and Dr. Falk Feddersen, who led this study, used that to replicate a coastal water pollution event and to track it in the coastal environment, in the surf zone and nearshore environment. Basically, under the premise is, if you could see it, or if you can detect the pollution easier, it's easier to track where it goes. This magenta dye can be detected through fluorescence techniques and other techniques with great sensitivity. So here, that dye is mimicking a water pollution event in coastal waters. We collaborated with the coastal oceanographers, and we sampled the coastal air for aerosols at the same time in that area there. My colleague, Dr. Charlotte DeWald, is sampling along the beach, and you might even be able to pick up that the surf zone there is also has a tint of that dye, and that's at a street end. And that's in this photo, and myself on top of the Estuary Interpretive Center roof there, which is at the far right edge of the large photo, sampling the air for this dye. So to get into some results, this dye was detected over land and downwind of dye in the coastal waters. So with this study, we had a unique compound to look for, this dye, which the only source of it is the waters.
So I go to register for class.
And so here we see a data set in the magenta in the water offshore. This provides us with the maximum extent of that dye in the coastal waters during that one of 3 dye releases. And then on land, you see some triangles, and those are our sampling locations. And the magenta triangle pointing up is where we detected dye in the air downwind of those dyed coastal waters. 3 dye releases were conducted. With the second one, the dye was quickly moved up the coast, up into Coronado. And while this brought it out of range for us to be able to detect it in the air, it was still a very valuable iteration of this experiment because it very clearly demonstrated the rapid transport of a longshore transport of coastal water pollution when you under the right conditions. Here there was a south swell in the water, and that causes a longshore current from south to north, and it rapidly transported that dye up even out of this image you're seeing here up to the coast into Coronado, showing that coastal water pollution moves in those waters significant distances and rapidly under the right conditions. The third dye release, the dye more local to the release site, and we picked it up again downwind of those dyed waters, where at the magenta triangle pointing up labeled I. In both dye release 1 on the left and dye release 3, we detected it in the dye in the air on 2 consecutive days following that dye release. So it's important to note, and at a maximum distance about 0.7 kilometers inland. This study was a clear demonstration that the dye transferred to the atmosphere and seaspray aerosol was blown into the coastal community, and that dye is mimicking coastal water pollution. So it demonstrated that coastal water pollution can transfer into seaspray aerosol and reach people on land through this airborne transmission pathway. So now that brings us to what about real coastal water pollution, as we are looking in the previous image. So we returned to the field as a group using our improved ability to detect bacteria and also chemical compounds in aerosol samples, and with the objective to investigate signs of coastal water pollution, aerosolizing, and sea spray aerosol. And that is kind of the where this talk came from, as we had the study was recently published just last month in the journal Environmental Science and Technology, demonstrating bacterial and chemical evidence of coastal water pollution from the Tijuana River and sea spray aerosol. So to get into that, here I show the sampling sites for this study. We sampled coastal water and coastal aerosol for 5 different periods in 2019, spanning from January into May. In the bottom panel, that shows the sampling sites in the region of Imperial Beach, including pier water there at the top left, so sampling the coastal waters off the Imperial Beach Pier, sampling the Tijuana River there at the far right, and then 2 aerosol sampling locations. We sampled at the one in the north for 2 rounds of sampling and one in the south for 2 rounds of sampling. We also conducted daily water sampling at Scripps Institution of Oceanography to see what's in the water there. And we also had a round of aerosol sampling there, and that's for comparison. So the important part is to compare water and aerosol composition in Imperial Beach and in the Tijuana River with what's in the water and air in La Jolla at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. Always good to make a comparison to see what's different. And so our approach was to identify bacteria molecules found in the Tijuana River and also in Imperial Beach aerosols. We want to make that connection. We also emphasized aerosols coming from the ocean. And we wanted to rule out ubiquitous bacteria and molecules using the water and aerosol we sampled at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. So here's a photo from the field. This sampling location IBSCA was sampled from the second floor of the Dempsey Holder Safety Center in Imperial Beach, sampled there for 2 rounds. And then we also sampled at Borderfield State Park atop Monument Mesa, just across from Friendship Park. There in the top photo, you can see our mobile lab on the left of Claire giving the thumbs up, or her right. And in the background, you can see the bull ring there in Tijuana. So we're right up real close to the border. And then another shot from below gives you an overview, a kind of a lay of the land. We're up on top of that mesa, sampling aerosol. Another part of the study, as I mentioned, is wind direction. So we use local wind data and also an atmospheric transport model to characterize aerosol samples, is whether they were coming from the land, from the ocean, or a combination. So here is one sampling period. So we would collect samples for basically a day. We would set them up, run the samples, collect aerosol samples onto filters and amongst other ways, and come back the next day and change the filters and collect that. And we then went back and looked at what the winds were doing. There's a wind rose in the top right. And basically that's saying the wind was blowing from these different directions at these different speeds for these different varying amounts of time of this sampling period. And then the other part of this image is the atmospheric transport model. And it shows us the long range transport. See what local winds are just telling you what's happening right there. But a particle, aerosols in the atmosphere are subjected to winds at all the locations they cross, and this ultimately determines their path. So what you use is an atmospheric transport model, and you run it in backwards mode, and you see where do the particles come from on a larger scale during the sampling period. And so here we see a period that was dominated by aerosols coming from the land, which isn't too clear with those the just using the local winds, which are changing. We did this. So here's some other examples of what it looks like when the particles came from over the ocean or a combination. We labeled that mixed, and we did this for all of our sampling periods. And then in our data analysis, we group samples. We have those aerosol samples where the particles mainly came over the ocean, but according to these data, as these indications, whether the where the aerosols came from predominantly over the land, or a combination. This allows us to investigate the data, taking into consideration where those aerosols came from. Are they likely to be dominated by particles coming from the land, major terrestrial sources such as car exhaust and industry and dust blowing off the land, or are they likely to have a majority of sea spray aerosol, and did the winds and aerosols blow over those local waters where local water pollution is existing. So it's really essential to look at where your particles came from. And so that's what we did here. A principal component analysis first indicates that aerosol chemical composition and bacteria community fall between ocean water and the Tijuana River water. So here in this plot, we have 2 dimensions. And in the vertical dimension, we have water samples at top, separating out from aerosol samples mostly down at the bottom. So the top left is ocean water samples. The top right is in blue is Tijuana River samples, and the triangles down further below is aerosol samples. Now, left to right, the aerosol samples fell in terms of their chemical composition in between the ocean water samples and the Tijuana River samples, indicating that the aerosol chemical composition is made up of a mixture of chemical compounds that are found both in the ocean and also in the Tijuana River. It's just the first piece of evidence here that we look at. We did the same thing with bacteria, the bacteria composition of these samples. So I'll slow down a bit. Each dot on here is a sample, whether it's an ocean water sample, an aerosol sample, or a river water, Tijuana River water sample. And in the chemical composition, where it falls in this space is made up of its diverse chemical composition. This chemical analysis tells you thousands of chemicals found in each sample. And so then you lay them out in space. There's points that plot close to each other means that they had similar chemical compositions. You could think about it as almost like a fingerprint or their makeup. With bacteria, again, each point is a sample, and we have ocean water samples and river water samples and aerosol samples. And where they fall in this space is a function of the many different types of bacteria that were found in each sample. So I hope that clarifies a little bit. And similarly with the bacteria that plotted up here, which separates out vertically from the water samples, it fell in between, left to right, between the ocean water samples and the river water samples, again indicating the bacteria community in the aerosol samples had shared features with shared bacteria with the ocean water and also the river water. Just suggestive evidence. Another analysis we did, which takes those information and it finds commonalities, and it says how similar were those chemical and bacteria compositions of those different sample types. So it does a source apportionment is another way to put that. And what we see here are these vertical bars. Each vertical bar, which has blue, orange, brown, and gray in it, represents one sample. And this statistical analysis says how much of this aerosol sample had shared features, or how similar was it to these other possible sources. Or possible sources are those river water samples, are ocean water samples at Imperial Beach and at Scripps Oceanography, and also unknown. We also acknowledge that in our aerosol, not everything in our aerosol samples comes from these possible sources. But here we have more suggestive evidence showing what fraction of these chemical compounds in each sample are shared with the Tijuana River. That's the height of those blue bars, and that scale goes from 0 to 1. 0 would mean for that given aerosol sample, none of the chemical compounds found in that aerosol sample were also found in the Tijuana River, for example. What we see here is we see moderate levels between, say, roughly around 25% of the chemical compounds in our aerosol samples were also found in the Tijuana River. Okay, so now that is quantifying kind of what we saw in the last slide. There was even more similarity in the bacteria composition of our aerosol samples with the Tijuana River, showing upwards up to 70% of bacteria found in aerosol samples also found in the Tijuana River. So again, further evidence that there are shared chemical compounds in bacteria in the aerosol with the Tijuana River. We took things even further, and we asked ourselves, and through data analysis, we asked the data, are there molecules or chemical compounds in bacteria that are high in the Tijuana River and high in Imperial Beach aerosols, specifically in periods that had C-spray aerosols? That'd be the periods that we deemed as C or as mixed. And were they also low in the water at Scripps Oceanography, in the water and air, and also in aerosols in Imperial Beach coming from the land? Here we want to rule out ubiquitous chemical compounds in bacteria that are also found in La Jolla. We also want to rule out chemical compounds in bacteria that come from the land. So this is a bit of a tall task to do and to attempt. And then we ranked the bacteria molecules based on those criteria. So we came up with high in the Tijuana River and IB aerosols and low in SIO. We developed a ranking system. And here I show you one example of one bacterium after we ranked all the bacteria according to these criteria. This is bacterium number 13 in our list, so it ranked number 13. From the genus Hydrogenophaga. And what we did here is then we went back and plotted its abundance, its relative abundance in the different water samples. And you see a lot of different points here, but on the left you can see it had varying levels, but up to relatively high levels. On the left there, and those blue dots in the Tijuana River, and those were much higher than its abundance in the ocean water at Scripps Oceanography, and also in the ocean water at Imperial Beach. Even I don't know if my controls are hiding that. Maybe I should hide. Hide that. I don't know if that's being blocked. So again, on the left-hand side of that dotted line shows that this bacterium was strongly associated with the Tijuana River. On the right-hand side of that dotted line, we see that this bacterium was also strongly associated with aerosol samples that had sea spray aerosol. That's the C periods, that's the blue triangles, and also the green triangles. Then it was also low in aerosol samples where the aerosol population was dominated by aerosols from the land. That's the pink triangles. It was not detected in the aerosols at Scripps Oceanography. You see no dot there where there would be a purple triangle. And it was also low in our blanks. We collect blanks just to make sure this is not some contamination, et cetera. So that's one example of one bacterium, which shows this pretty strong association with the Tijuana River and in aerosols coming from over the ocean there in Imperial Beach. And so we did that for all of them, and we picked out the top 40. And so here's the data for all the top 40. You don't necessarily need to look at everyone individually, but almost if you just kind of relax your eyes, you can see this pattern occurring in almost all of them, is they have that strong association with the Tijuana River in those blue circles, and also a strong association with aerosols coming from over the ocean in the sea and mixed periods. They're low in aerosols coming from the land. That's the pink triangles. Some you see some pink triangles, and also low in the blanks. So here, that's our evidence of these bacteria are coming specifically from the Tijuana River, flowing into the coastal waters, and then the breaking waves of the coastal waters are ejecting those polluted coastal waters and containing these bacteria, which are then blown onshore by the common onshore sea breeze. And almost all these top 40 show that evidence. We did the same thing for the top 40 molecules, and with what we found with the molecules is we did find molecules both found in the Tijuana River and also in our aerosols coming from over the ocean. But almost all of these molecules were also highest in aerosols coming from the land. So that means that, yes, they are present in the Tijuana River flowing into coastal waters and then being aerosolized. They also have sources from on land. So they are not, say, unique tracers of the aerosolized coastal water pollution, but we can observe them in the river and in those coastal aerosols coming from the ocean. So that is confirmed. And this is great because it also gives us chemical information on what chemical compounds are found in the river that are also being aerosolized, despite the fact that they also have sources from on land. There are the data for all 40. And again, The one on the left is just an example that I picked out. This kind of on average shows this on average pattern of significant. So yes, they're associated with the Tijuana River, and yes, they're present in aerosols coming from the ocean. They also have sources from on the land. The identities, these are tentative identities of these chemical compounds in here. So before this point, we're just using them as almost kind of like a tracer. You know, do we have chemical compounds and say bacteria present in the Tijuana River and also in the aerosol? Here now it tells us what does their identities tell us about what they are, and what we see here is that they're strongly indicative of pollution. A lot of these are foreign compounds, foreign from the environment. They'd be environmental contaminants. So you see their names under the annotation column, and probably more interesting is tags. What is known about these chemical compounds? Where they come from? And you see known environmental pollutants, flame retardants, things found in waxes and polishes, detergents, plasticizers, industrial chemical reagents, and dietary supplement, for example, is a great tag of a river that's polluted by sewage. And so also plasticizers, and the number 16 is a cyanobacteria, which is the compound is associated with cyanobacteria, which is a great indicator that we are picking up sea spray aerosol. So that's what their chemical information tells us. So these are what chemicals are most commonly found in these polluted sea spray aerosol. Another part of this story is that an independent study identified bacteria in Tijuana sewage and in the Tijuana River the same year and months that we sampled. They were also sampling just the water, both the river water, also effluents from a sewage treatment plant further to the south, and also the coastal waters. So this is great because we were able to have independent confirmation using this study about our bacteria information. And so here I provide the identities of our top 16 bacteria before I showed the data behind the top 40 of our list. It shows the taxonomy there. Many of these were identified at the genus, the family, genus, or species level. And which is what often is the result of 16S amplicon sequencing, it doesn't identify individual strains that's higher resolution, but it tells us this level up to maybe all the way up to the species level. And this column here, sewage, asks, are these say families or genre or species of bacteria known to be associated with sewage? We give that criteria in its own column because you see many of these are known to be associated with sewage. And then where it says TJ means that independent study found these types of bacteria to be, the independent study found them in Tijuana sewage, separate from us. And now these are the same bacteria that we detected in aerosols coming from the ocean. So it's independent confirmation that these bacteria are sewage associated that we found in our aerosols coming from the ocean. We also asked, do these groups of bacteria, so think of every row here, say row number 1, genus Archobacter, species Cryophilus. That's not a specific strain, that's still a group. There are many different species or many different strains even at the species level, but we asked at that level, does that genus or does that species even, or a family, whatever level it was detected at, is it known to contain pathogens? And what we see here at the top 14, we see roughly half of them are known to also contain pathogens. Now, our analyses aren't able to confirm whether or not we detected a pathogen, but we can say that these groups that we detected do contain pathogens. Pathogens must be detected at the strain level, but still worth mentioning. And then here, other information that's known about them. These top bacteria, foodborne, are known to have antimicrobial resistance. NFGNB is non-fermentive gram-negative bacilli. It's this group of bacteria of emergent and concern, and they showed up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times in this list of top 16 and even more in our top 40. So they were present. Many of these, like I said, foodborne bacteria that are known to be associated with sewage. So therefore their identities are further confirmation that these are sewage-associated bacteria flowing into these coastal waters, transferring to the atmosphere, and sea aerosol being blown on land and reaching people on land. The last bit of data I'll show here demonstrates that these bacteria make up a significant portion of the airborne population in Imperial Beach. So here, each column is a sample, an aerosol sample, again grouped by whether that the aerosol population primarily came from the ocean or land or mixed, or from Scripps Oceanography, and then the blanks, and then each row is a type of bacteria. So each square means if that bacteria in that row was, if it's a dark square, it was high abundance in that sample or low abundance in that sample. For example, you see underneath where it says SIO, these bacteria, these are our top, all of our top 40 now, were largely absent from aerosols at Scripps Oceanography. You can see some dark squares underneath aerosols coming from the sea and aerosols coming from mixed sea and land atmospheric transport. The next step here is to then sum these columns. So each square is the fractional abundance. So did on the scale say, so 0.1 would be a black square of 0.1 means that bacterium accounted for 10% of the bacteria identified in that sample according to our methods, 16S gene amplicon sequencing. So if you sum all those squares in each column, that tells you what is the fractional abundance of these 40 bacteria amongst all of the bacteria present in that sample. So did these top 40 bacteria comprise 5% of the total bacteria in that aerosol sample, or 10% or more? So by summing those columns, so there's the column and there's the rows, and we sum the columns, and that's what we see underneath. And again, I'll just hide this panel. Those sums of columns tell us the fractional abundance of these top 40 bacteria in each of those samples. And you can see first, those blue bars are higher in the aerosol samples from sea and mixed and lower in the other types. And we were surprised to see just how tall these bars are. Underneath each bar is its value. So it's fractional abundance. So you see one that's 0.5. So that means that 50%, these 40 bacteria comprised 50% of the bacteria in that air sample. So these top 40 bacteria associated with Tijuana River pollution comprise up to 76% of the bacteria in the air on that given day in Imperial Beach. So we were very surprised at just how tall those blue bars were. So again, stating that up to 76% of the bacteria in Imperial Beach coastal air link to pollution during these times. So just to wrap things up, with the Seaside Dye Project, we've demonstrated an airborne transmission pathway for coastal water pollution. And then in the study we just went over, we've identified chemicals and bacteria from coastal water pollution in sea spray aerosol, demonstrating the transfer of real coastal water pollution flowing. So linking from a known source of pollution, the Tijuana River, flowing into those coastal waters and then being blown onshore aerosolizing and ceasewear aerosol being blown onshore and under conditions of onshore wind. And we had a lot of support for this work, including the Incinerator Imperial Beach lifeguards, and also the Tijuana River National Estuary Research Reserve and the California State Parks, California Border Patrol agents, households helped us with this work, and also other collaborators at UCSD and Scripps Oceanography were helpful. All of this happened on Kumeyaay land. I study Kumeyaay language and culture at the Kumeyaay Community College, and I just want to acknowledge the original inhabitants of this land who still live here today, and they are keeping their language and culture alive and well. And anyone interested, I encourage you to take a class at the Kumeyaay Community College. It's part of the San Diego Community College District. So get involved, and there's always cultural events such as building boats and taking them out in the water. I want to show some pictures from the field. This is just what it's looked like carrying out this, carrying out this research. It was fun doing it. Here's Dr. Pedro Belda pipetting in the back of a truck as we're dodging rainstorms there at the Imperial Beach Pier. There he is again with Dr. Brock Mitz in our mobile lab collecting aerosol samples. And there's Dr. Daniel Petrus and Dr. Catherine Mayer driving the truck out in the field while we're doing our sampling. So I want to leave it at that, and also want to make sure I acknowledge funding sources, the Understanding and Protecting the Planet at UCSD and Scripps Oceanography, also the Dankberg Family Foundation, which was on another slide, and also CASE, the Center for Aerosol Impacts on the Chemistry and the Environment, was also a funding source. So at that, I guess maybe we'll open it up for questions or discussion.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Pendergraft. Absolutely fascinating set of research, and thank you for doing it. Let me begin with what to me is sort of the most obvious question. Assuming pollution is harmful to humans and other life beings, do you have any picture of the geography over which this pollution flows in the air and then back down, presumably to the ground, that would potentially create harm to, to the biome, if you will? If you're living next to this, obviously it's not good, but how far does that umbrella of danger exist? Do you know?
Yeah, great question. So our findings first are strictly limited to our sampling sites, which were right along the coast. But as I showed in one of the first images of that smoke blowing across the continent, is aerosols are small enough to remain suspended in the atmosphere and travel great distances. For example, research has shown linked bacteria detected along the west coast of the United States coming from Asia. So the lifetime of aerosols in the atmosphere, how long they stay suspended, is a function of their size, and then also whether or not they're likely to form clouds and rain so they can get rained at. So we call this dry deposition, falling out due to gravitational settling, or rain out. And so basic aerosol science tells us that aerosols travel great distances in the atmosphere. Therefore, what's happening as all of these particles, move downwind, you have mixing, you have losses over time and space, and you also have dilution. But we know that they're going to be traveling further inland than just our sampling sites. Further research could work on making these connections at further distances, say from the polluted waters.
Great, thank you. Kevin?
Thank you, Matthew. I had a sort of personal question. So can I ask, how did you become focused on this subject? How did you what was your sort of development, or your how did the focus come about?
Yeah, great question. I touched on earlier that I came to this doctoral program to study aerosols due to their climate roles in the atmosphere. But with a focus on sea spray aerosol, I'm familiar with the coastal water pollution problem being from Imperial Beach. And pretty early on, I set that in my sights, and although I wasn't exactly sure how to go about it. And so what happened over the course of my PhD is I learned more and made more collaborations. So the collaborations were key. Say collaborating with the night lab, who does the sequencing, and we worked on them to improve our ability to sequence and identify bacteria and sea spray aerosols. Similarly, with the chemical data, I got put in contact with Dr. Daniel Petrus, who is a leader in those chemical analyses, which can tell you all the way down to molecular level information, which is not easy to do. That's the cutting edge, and to be able to identify specific molecules. And so it was a combination of building skills, learning more, but also the collaborations were super key in order to carry out this work. And this was very much a group effort, not just within my group, but also a collaborative effort between multiple research groups at UCSD.
Thank you.
Wonderful. From what I've read, it seems that pollution from the Tijuana River along our coast, closing our beaches and so forth, has probably been a problem for at least the last century. What is needed to stop this pollution? Can we even do it? Is it possible? Does this also, related to this, does this pollution impact the North County beaches? Maybe you answered that as no, or not so much. And what beaches should be closed, and are there, well, I guess just that, what practices do we need to stop the pollution?
Great, thank you for the questions. So while we did look at specific tracers of the Tijuana River and coastal aerosol, in San Diego and worldwide, coastal water pollution is widespread. So coastal waters in North County are also get polluted, maybe not from the Tijuana River, but from runoff following rains. And other research has shown that can still contain pollutants, microbial pollutants, sewage-associated pollutants. It perhaps is not just as bad as it is in South County. And so what this work shows is that us inhabitants of the coasts, which worldwide, that's about maybe half of all humans, depending on how you break things down, that we are exposed to coastal water pollution, even when we don't enter the waters, even when we don't, say, eat the seafood. The onshore flow is very common because differential heating between the land and the ocean causes the sea breeze. And so when we have polluted coastal waters, you have coastal populations being exposed to those polluted waters through this airborne transmission pathway. And this work now does not solve that problem, but I'd like to think it provides a additional reasoning why we want to clean up our coastal waters.
Devin?
Sure. Okay. So this question comes from John, and he's asking, how high do the different aerosols go into the atmosphere? And so my sort of add-on to that is then, if the aerosols are contaminated, does that mean that it's actually going up into the clouds? Does that mean we're getting rained on by contaminants as well?
Yeah. The atmosphere, and particularly say like the troposphere, the part of the atmosphere, Lowe's atmosphere, is generally well mixed. So mixing will then also cause dilution. But in what we saw from the dye study, which was really interesting, is at least in these shorter distances, that sea spray aerosol really moves on a pretty straight path from what we can tell in downwind. And then vertical mixing is to be determined, but if with going back to the image of smoke in the atmosphere, when things move up to higher levels in the atmosphere where you have higher wind speeds, then say for the same residence time in the atmosphere, you have further downwind transport. So the coastal ocean is very complex, but also so is the coastal atmosphere. But from what we can tell, things are definitely staying aloft on these short distances, and due to their particle size, they're likely to stay aloft, get mixed in the atmosphere, and move further inland. And then, yes, there exists the potential for them to be rained out. They can be rained out. They don't necessarily have to form clouds and rain. They can, if they're in the air above our heads and rain occurs, they'll be raining out onto us by getting scavenged by falling raindrops.
Thank you. Recent reports indicate that at least 25,000 barrels and perhaps more than 100,000 barrels of DDT were dumped into the ocean between LA and Catalina in the 1970s. Some of those barrels are leaking, and the seafloor is covered with DDT-infused soil and slime, a real bonus. Is this likely to impact our coastal aerosols or in our coastal, well, certainly pollutants? I know state and federal environmental agencies are working on some kind of cleanup, but is there anything that we in San Diego should be doing or thinking about?
Great question, and yeah, great connection to another environmental issue we have here in the local area or region. My understanding of, say, vertical mixing in the ocean is you need conditions to bring those contaminants to the surface. And from the seafloor is a bit of a stretch. Of course, there's going to be some dilution in mixing, but if the observations, if that's correct, that it's really a coating on the seafloor, then that's indicative of its concentration there. I'm not familiar with that topic. I will relate it to something, which is if it does make it to the surface, it's likely to be aerosolized. Now, is it going to make it to the surface in significant concentrations? That I don't know. My assumption is no. You would need some pretty specific conditions in order to get that to mix up to the surface at high levels. Luckily, so still, I don't think it's anything we want, nor do I think it was a good idea for the things to be disposed that way.
Hard to argue with that statement. Devin?
Sure. Okay. This comes from Miriam. She's curious, what impact, if any, would the temperature of the water have on the aerosols?
Great. This is can relate to the last question, which is if inputs into the waters that are warmer than the receiving waters could then cause them to make it to the surface. And in our research, this process, aerosolization, is not evaporation. I want to be clear about that. So evaporation is very sensitive to temperature. And evaporation is you have individual molecules, say of water, transferring from the liquid phase to the gas phase. Here, sea spray aerosol production is breaking waves and bursting bubbles. You have those bubble caps are bursting, and you have the cavity underneath them collapsing and sending jet drops, what we call. And that's going to happen at any temperature. There are other factors that are at play here that can influence this, such as surf size. So more surf as you're increasing your production mechanism. Also, if you have strong enough winds in the area to have white caps, now you don't just have the surf zone as a source, but you also have that all white cap area. So there are other environmental drivers that are more important than temperature, but they do definitely influence the aerosolization. If that helps.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Going back to your first, some of your early comments in the discussion, you were talking about the cooling effect of aerosols. And I recently attended a lecture in which the speaker was pointing to low sulfur fuels that are now being used, and very likely a 0.5 degree increase centigrade in temperature is a result of the aerosols, the sulfur aerosols in particular, no longer cooling or reducing the cooling effect. Is there any impact of these coastal aerosols in climate temperature and
Yeah, good question. With coastal aerosols or with sea spray aerosol and coastlines being a significant source of all sea spray aerosol, they definitely form clouds, and there's a cooling effect there. And so I like to look at, when I look at satellite imagery like we're looking before, you see it's amazing how much of the ocean is covered by clouds, and contrast that with the land. It's very different there. There's many things at play. So yes, the sea spray aerosol definitely forms clouds, and that has a cooling effect. Now perhaps the next step would be, what is the effect of pollution with, say, cloud formation? And that's an interesting one, because bacteria, due to their size, are effective at cloud formation. Most particles that are above 0.5 micron are effective cloud condensation nuclei, and so bacteria fall there. But we have to keep in mind that the aerosolization of the pollution in different bacteria is happening amongst a background of bacteria and chemical compounds from seawater already being aerosolized. And is the source significant enough to have, say, climate relevant impacts? Is worth asking and merits additional research. There are some instances where trace particles really do have a big impact, and that's with the ice nuclei. They say, on average, say there's one atmospheric aerosol in 1 million is an effective ice nucleus. So these are rare particles, but play a really big role in the atmosphere by their ability to form ice at elevated temperatures. So that's an instance just where rare particles really can have an impact.
Thank you.
This question comes from Eleonora, and it's a little above my head, my pay grade. It says, can you explain the slide that shows the freezing by bacteria versus NaSO4? And the question is, what is -40? Is that OC?
Oh, yeah, great. So I can show it, but perhaps it's simple enough to just explain. So -40 is that lower limit. If basically without the presence of any ice nucleus, that'd be about the temperature where just a pure water droplet would freeze if it was suspended in the atmosphere. And then all the temperatures above that, I showed a bar. Yeah, I can go back to that. So the -40 is a temperature, It's the temperature range we're looking at there. I'll go back to sharing my screen here. So yeah, our bottom axis there is temperature. On the left of -40, we have the blue line at -40, which would mean neutral or no ice nucleation ability. To the left of that line is antifreeze, basically, further dropping the freezing temperature. To the right of that line is ice nucleation, promoting the freezing of water at warmer temperatures. And so sodium sulfate there results in the freezing of water at a range of temperatures, generally at or below -40. So it has an antifreeze effect, whereas bacteria has an ice nucleation effect, the opposite of antifreeze. It promotes freezing as it freezes, say, you want to say the average of that green bar is at about -20. So it's promoting the freezing of water. Does that help?
I believe so, yes. Thank you.
Okay.
Evan, you go.
Okay, so let's see. Let's get this one. If the conclusions to your ongoing research point to a significant public health threat, do you foresee policy implementation toward eliminating the source of water pollution from the TJ River? And this is from Merrill. And this is sort of towards that policy.
I hope so. I mean, I would definitely like to see it. Stemming from that, people say, so what do we do about this? You know, the air is polluted from the polluted coastal waters, and in the short term, we can say in your home, use air filtration, such as these Corsi Rosenthal boxes, which you can build for under $100 and do a great job of filtering the air. So maybe in times when really bad water quality and you live near the coast, you can filter your indoor air and maybe limit outdoor exposure, which someone may say, well, that's not great. And I agree. Luckily that we can turn off the real source of this if we clean up our coastal waters and prevent this coastal water pollution. So in this case, luckily we can do that. If you ask me, my opinion, we can do that a lot easier than we can solve the climate problem. So at least in this case, we have the ability to treat effluents, urban and effluents before they reach the ocean. It's just a matter of doing it. I'll add that there's money set aside and plans underway to do that, and so the issue is being addressed. I hope those efforts are highly effective. That's planned infrastructure for this region, the border region.
I think the EPA had allocated $300 million to work on the pollution control near the border on the river, and there was political struggles between the US and Mexico to figure out how to allocate that money, how to spend it, who controls it, and so there's politics as well as the science.
And there's sort of a follow-up or a connected question here from Jay. Do you see a marked increase of the sewage released along the coast impacting the health of local surfers and sea mammals? Do you see that to a greater degree during your research, or did you see that to a greater degree during your research?
So this work didn't do any monitoring of health of humans or sea life. It does demonstrate the exposure, highlighting the exposure of people not in those waters. I would say that someone who then enters those waters is just going to significantly increase their exposure. through that direct contact.
Yeah.
So that's going to be a larger exposure to the coastal water pollution of anyone or anything in those waters. But we show that even if someone doesn't go in those waters, still may be exposed to the coastal water pollution through the air.
Okay.
Do you have more, Darren?
Sure, there's a few more.
Oh,
So this is again from Jay, and he's curious about your work. Is your work connected with the human microbiome research being done at UCSD, connecting the sewage bacteria along the coast?
Great question. Yes, at UCSD, the sequencing lab we collaborated with, the night lab, they work on the human microbiome project, and so we benefited from that to get to collaborate with world leaders in sequencing and microbiome studies, and we got to work with them directly on this topic. And here it's a strange one, I guess, because with the human microbiome project, exciting findings of the diversity of our gut microbiome. Here we have that gut microbiome coming back to us through polluted waters, then being aerosolized and reaching us on land. But yes, very fortunate to be at a place like UC San Diego and Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and the other labs around are world leaders in what they do.
Okay, this question comes from Miriam, and she's curious about, could you elaborate briefly on the next study you're working on and related to this?
Yeah, so a team from the Prather research group has been sampling water and aerosols in this same area over this rainy season, which is still lingering a little bit with these last days of weather. In order to get at these other questions, such as like spatial and temporal extent, that we weren't able to get to with this study, but related to some of the questions that have been asked. So more sampling is underway.
Okay, here's another question from Merrill. Do other polluted bodies of water, including rivers, lakes, etc., pose the same aerosol threats?
There are lake spray aerosol. So yes, that is also a potential risk with especially large lakes, as large as the Great Lakes, where there's enough fetch to have surfable waves. And if the waves are big enough to surf, they're also a significant aerosol source, especially for the immediate surroundings. And I have a friend, Dr. Bridget Seegers, who works for NASA, and they monitor harmful algal blooms. This is another way that water quality is impacted by a kind of a hybrid natural-unnatural cycle. And so harmful algal blooms, red tides, produce a toxin, and that toxin is aerosolized. Research done along Florida has demonstrated that. People have experienced it and don't need any research to tell them that. So lakes as well are a source of aerosols, and if the lake water is polluted by sewage, industrial effluents, harmful algal blooms, people are at risk of being exposed to those people on land through aerosolization of those polluted waters.
it would seem like it would be aggravated by waterfalls also. Think of Niagara Falls. Must be a lot of aerosol there.
Yeah, be a bad place for a major pollution spill above the falls.
This question comes from Chiwa, and I'm probably getting the name wrong, and I apologize. How far north do you think the exposure problem spreads along the coast?
Yeah, good question. So we conducted this research during the wet season, where often well, prior to say 2020, or even for the, traditionally in past decades, water pollution events were often associated with rain. Rain results in the combined stormwater runoff and sewage, those combined flows in Tijuana, and it becomes too much and it gets diverted. But if you talk about south to north transport, like we saw in that second dye release, we have to think about the summer. Recent research by the coastal oceanographers that we collaborated with has shown that for San Diego beaches, summertime is particularly problematic because there are also pollution releases, and you have south swells and south to north alongshore transport. The risk in a study that came out in, I believe, 2022, I think Falk Feddersen was the lead author on that. And I think his website at UCSD, you can just go to falk.ucsd.edu/publications, something like that. That work showed significant risk, even up into Coronado. Now the shoreline of San Diego is not very conducive to longshore transport being very strong and concentrated due to Point Loma and the mouth of San Diego Bay. And that's coming from the Tijuana River. I would say, though, still North County beaches and many coastal places do experience pollution after rain events. Not so intense, but it's there. There's a study led by Josh Steele that demonstrates that at beaches like Tourmaline and beyond. So that's how the northward extent could happen from local sources in the north.
And then this is from Niels, and let me see if I can find that better. Are there studies showing aerosol pollution problems around the world? And this was asked by Merrill also, but are there any specific areas that you know of in the world having the most pollution, or what would be the most problematic areas?
If the question is asking just aerosol pollution in general, that would be the areas of porous air quality. Traditionally, we monitor air quality just by particle counts. The more particle counts, the more material in the air, the worse it is for our health. And we know of places with terrible air qualities, such as Los Angeles, such as Mexico City, such as places in China and areas like that. That sounds like what the question was getting at, but if it was asking where is this problem of aerosolized coastal water pollution the worst, you would have to look at where is coastal water pollution the worst, and then you need that's mostly it. You're likely also along coastlines to have breaking waves and onshore winds. So it would be wherever coastal water, the combination of highest coastal water pollution, breaking waves, onshore winds, and then also perhaps population, the more people being exposed, you could also say it would be one way to say it's the worst. Where exactly that is, I don't know, but many of the world's largest cities, not just in the United States, but worldwide, with tens of millions of inhabitants, many of them fall along the coast. So I would look where the largest populations are.
If you consider plastic pollution, apparently Asia along the coast is particularly bad. So they probably relate. Well, this has been wonderful, fantastic. Marion?
Yes, I'd like to interject a little bit. I think that we skipped Amy Stewart's question, and I'll give that to you briefly. She was asking if the purple air monitor would pick up the pollution from the aerosol spray.
So the purple air monitor can detect particles. And so as I was saying, usually with air quality, we just go off of particle counts or amounts, but not composition. The purple air can't tell you particle composition. And here this study relied on particle composition, chemical composition, and bacteria composition. A lot of aerosol science still in the past and even now, just by being able to tell particle amounts, it gives you an idea of air quality, and then also particle sizes is also informative because particle size often reveals the particle type. But the purple air monitor won't be able to identify, say, aerosols from coastal water pollution. So it can identify perhaps just higher and lower levels of aerosols. That's all.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, thank you so much. I would like to let you know that there's a couple of really great, wonderful environmental groups that are here tonight. There is Amy Stewart, and she's with the Emerald Keepers, and they're based in Coronado. And we also have the Clean Earth for Kids group, and they are very involved with working with the toxins and trying to clean up our environment. We have the Solana Beach Eco Rotary represented, and we also have surf riders represented. And I would like to encourage each one of those groups to please put the name of your organizations and your contact information into the chat. And I would like to encourage all of us to save that chat to be able to refer back to it. And again, as always, I want to thank our wonderful audience. But Matthew, I would particularly like to thank you. This was a very informative presentation. And I also would like to thank Elizabeth Mosley for finding you and encouraging you to give us your time. And here at the North County Climate Change, we have a tradition of saying thank you to our speakers by buying a tree in your behalf, which will be planted in an area here in California that's been burnt by the wildfires that we have had trouble with over the last few years. So again, thank you so much, and we appreciate everything, and we appreciate all of us working together on this. It's a very important topic. So please save the chat, and we will see all of you next month. And again, thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Dr. Pendergraft.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all very much. Thank you
Bye-bye.
for the gift, the tree. Thank you all for,
Mhm.
you
Thank
for
you.
inviting me.